He gave his last $5 to a man starving on the street, a simple act of kindness from a boy who had nothing. But that stranger wasn't just hungry. He was the most powerful man in the city, and that $5 bill just became a debt of honor that would change everything. The rain didn't just fall in this part of Chicago, it clawed its way down, turning the alleys into murky flowing rivers and the neon signs into blurred watercolors of red and blue. For Leo, the rain was a constant companion, a cold, wet blanket that seeped through the worn-out soles of his sneakers and into his bones. At 17, home was a word that belonged to other people, a warm, bright place he could only visit in his daydreams. His reality was the biting wind that whipped around the corners of Fullerton Avenue, the gnawing emptiness in his stomach, and the crumpled $5 bill in his pocket. It was his last one. He'd earned it by helping a grocer unload a truck of cabbages, the smell of damp earth still clinging to his fingertips. That $5 was supposed to be dinner, maybe a hot dog from the vendor on the corner, the kind that steamed in the chilly air and made your mouth water just watching someone else take a bite. It was a lifeline, a tiny anchor in a sea of uncertainty. He was huddled in the doorway of a closed bakery, trying to shield himself from the worst of the downpour. When he saw him, the man was sitting on an overturned milk crate in the alley across the street, his shoulders slumped, his face hidden by the brim of a drenched hat. He wasn't dressed like the other homeless folks Leo knew. His coat, though soaked and mud-splattered, was made of fine wool, the kind you'd see on the mannequins in the expensive department stores downtown. His shoes were leather, cracked and ruined by the water, but clearly once a symbol of wealth. The man wasn't moving. He just sat there, staring at the rain-slicked pavement as if it held the answers to the universe. But it was his stillness that caught Leo's attention. It wasn't the agitated, restless energy of someone desperate for their next fix, nor the defeated slump of someone who had given up long ago. It was a quiet, profound exhaustion, a weariness that seemed to emanate from his very soul. Leo watched him for a long time, the hunger in his own stomach a dull, persistent ache. He saw the man's hand tremble slightly as he raised it to wipe the rain from his face, and in that small, involuntary movement, Leo saw a reflection of his own vulnerability. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe it was the memory of his own mother, who always said that no matter how little you have, you can always share a piece of it. Maybe it was the simple, unspoken understanding of what it felt like to be invisible, to be just another shadow in a city full of ghosts. He clutched the $5 bill in his hand, the paper growing damp from his sweaty palm. It was his only safety net, the only thing standing between him and another night of gnawing hunger. He could turn away, pretend he hadn't seen the man, and buy his hot dog. No one would blame him. No one would even know, but he couldn't. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs, and walked out into the rain. The cars hissed by, sending up sprays of dirty water that soaked his jeans. He crossed the street, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. The man didn't look up as he approached. He just kept staring at the ground, lost in a world of his own. Leo stopped in front of him, the rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead. He held out the crumpled bill. "Here," he said, his voice barely a whisper above the sound of the storm. The man slowly lifted his head, and for the first time, Leo saw his face. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with a strong jaw and eyes that were a startling shade of grey like a stormy sky. They were tired eyes, but they were sharp, and they seemed to look right through Leo, seeing not just a skinny, rain-soaked kid, but something more. The man didn't speak. He just looked at the $5 bill, then back at Leo's face. Leo pushed the money closer. "You look like you need it more than I do," he said. "Go get yourself something hot to eat." He didn't wait for a reply. He simply placed the bill in the man's unmoving hand, closed the man's fingers around it, and turned to walk away. He didn't look back. He couldn't. If he did, he might regret it. As he disappeared back into the shadows of the bakery doorway, he felt a strange mix of emptiness and peace. His stomach was screaming, but for the first time in a long time, his heart felt full. He didn't know it then, but that simple act of kindness, that one small gesture of compassion, had just set in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. He had just fed the most feared and respected man in Chicago's underworld, a man who never forgot a debt and who repaid every kindness and every insult 100-fold. Comment below. Would you open that door? The peace that had filled Leo's heart was a fleeting warmth, quickly extinguished by the relentless cold. Hunger, once a dull ache, sharpened into a vicious, twisting pain in his gut. The smell of frying onions and sausages from the hot dog vendor on the corner, once a beacon of hope, was now a form of torture. Every gust of wind carried the scent directly to his hiding spot in the bakery doorway, a cruel reminder of the meal he had given away. He pressed his face against the cold glass of the shop, watching the bakers inside move through a world of warmth and light, their white uniforms dusted with flour. They were laughing, their movements easy and unburdened. For them, a $5 bill was nothing, a forgotten note in a wallet. For Leo, it had been everything. He wrapped his thin jacket tighter around himself, a futile attempt to ward off the chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Doubt began to creep in, a bitter, unwelcome guest. Had he been a fool? The man hadn't even said thank you. He had just stared with those unnerving grey eyes, his expression unreadable. Maybe he was just some drunk who would spend the money on cheap liquor, not food. The thought soured in his stomach. He had tried to do something good, to hold on to that small piece of his mother's teachings, but the reality of his situation was crashing down on him with the weight of the storm. He was alone, starving, and had just given away his only means of survival for the night. The city, which could feel so alive and full of promise during the day, transformed after dark into a labyrinth of danger for someone like him. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every distant shout sent a jolt of fear through him. He had to find a place to sleep, somewhere dry and relatively safe. The shelters were full, as they always were when the weather turned bad. He knew the routine. A spot under the Roosevelt Road Bridge was his best bet, but it was a long walk, and he had no energy. His body felt heavy, his limbs leaden with exhaustion and hunger. He pushed himself off the bakery wall, his legs unsteady beneath him. Just take it one step at a time, he told himself, a mantra he'd repeated on countless other nights like this one. One step, then another. As he shuffled down the sidewalk, keeping his head down to avoid the driving rain, a black sedan with tinted windows pulled up to the curb just ahead of him. It moved with a silent, predatory grace, its engine a low hum that was barely audible over the storm. Leo froze. Cars like that didn't belong in this neighborhood unless they were looking for trouble. He instinctively pressed himself back into the shadows of a recessed doorway, his heart hammering against his ribs. He watched as the back door opened and a large man in a dark suit stepped out, holding a black umbrella. The man didn't look around. He walked directly to the alley where Leo had last seen the stranger on the milk crate. For a moment, Leo thought he was about to witness a shakedown, or worse. But the man in the suit simply stood at the entrance to the alley, his posture respectful, almost reverent. He held the umbrella open, shielding someone who was stepping out of the shadows. It was the man from the milk crate. He looked different now. He had taken off the soaked hat, revealing a full head of silver hair, neatly combed. He stood straighter, the weariness replaced by an aura of quiet authority. He said something to the man with the umbrella, his voice too low for Leo to hear. Then he turned his head, and his stormy grey eyes scanned the street. For a terrifying second, Leo was sure the man was looking directly at him, that those piercing eyes could see him cowering in the darkness. He held his breath, his body rigid with fear. What did this mean? Who was this man who sat drenched in an alley one moment and was chauffeured in a luxury car the next? The man's gaze lingered on the bakery doorway for a fraction of a second before he turned and got into the back of the sedan. The man in the suit closed the door behind him, folded the umbrella, and got into the driver's seat. The car pulled away from the curb as silently as it had arrived, its red taillights disappearing into the rain-swept darkness. Leo remained frozen in the doorway, his mind racing. The encounter no longer felt like a simple act of charity. It felt like he had stumbled into something he didn't understand, something vast and dangerous. The fear was quickly replaced by a new, more unsettling feeling, a deep, chilling curiosity. The man had looked back. He had looked right at the spot where Leo had been standing. Did he know he was there? And if he did, what did that mean for a homeless kid who had just given him his last $5? The long walk to the bridge was a blur of misery. Leo's stomach felt like it was eating itself from the inside out. The rain had finally subsided to a cold drizzle, but the dampness had settled deep into his bones. When he finally reached the underpass, his heart sank. The usual spots, the ones that offered the most protection from the wind, were already taken. A small community of cardboard shelters and makeshift tents huddled together, the occupants already settled in for the night. He saw a few familiar faces, but they only offered him weary nods, their expressions mirroring his own exhaustion. There was no room. He was too late. He found a spot at the very edge of the encampment where the concrete sloped down towards the river and the wind was most fierce. All he had was a thin, damp piece of cardboard to put between himself and the cold ground. He curled into a tight ball, pulling the collar of his jacket up to his ears and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept replaying the image of the man with the grey eyes, the way he had looked at him, the silent departure in the black car. It made no sense. He must have drifted off at some point because the next thing he knew, a gentle nudge on his shoulder startled him awake. He shot up, his body instantly flooded with adrenaline, ready to run or fight. A figure was standing over him, silhouetted against the dim lights of the city. Leo scrambled backwards, his hand searching for a rock, a piece of glass, anything to defend himself. "Easy, kid," a low voice said. It was one of the older men from the shelter, a man they called Sal. Sal had been on the streets for years, and he had a reputation for being gruff, but fair. He was holding a steaming styrofoam cup and a small paper bag. "You looked like you were about to freeze to death," Sal grumbled, though his eyes held a flicker of concern. He pushed the cup and bag into Leo's hands. "Here." Leo stared at him, bewildered. "What's this? What's it look like? It's coffee and a sandwich." The coffee was hot, and the warmth spread through Leo's numb fingers. He opened the bag. Inside was a thick sandwich, still warm, wrapped in wax paper. It was roast beef, his favorite. He hadn't tasted roast beef in over a year. Where did you get this?" he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. Sal shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "Some guy drove by in a fancy car a little while ago, said he saw you shivering over here, gave me $20 and told me to get you something hot to eat and drink." Sal looked uncomfortable, as if he wasn't used to being the bearer of good news. "Said to tell you, let me see if I get this right. He said to tell you, a man of honor always repays his debts." Leo's hands trembled, and it wasn't from the cold anymore. He looked down at the sandwich, then out at the dark, flowing river, a fancy car, a man of honor. The words echoed in his mind, chasing away the hunger and the cold, replacing them with a profound sense of awe and a new, more potent kind of fear. This wasn't a coincidence. The man from the alley had found him. He knew where he was. The sandwich in his hands was no longer just food. It was a message. It was a sign that he was now connected to a world he couldn't possibly comprehend, a world of silent watchers and unspoken codes. And he had no idea if he was being protected or if he had just been marked. The next few days passed in a surreal haze for Leo. The memory of the warm sandwich and Sal's gruff delivery became a turning point, a small crack of light in his otherwise bleak existence. He never saw the black sedan again, nor the man with the stormy grey eyes, but he felt a change in the air around him. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The other homeless men under the bridge, who had once been territorial and suspicious, now treated him with a strange sort of deference. They would save him a dry spot, offer him a share of their meager findings, or simply leave him alone, their usual taunts and roughhousing directed elsewhere. It was as if a silent message had been passed through the community, an invisible shield placed around him. Leo didn't understand it, but he was grateful for the reprieve. The constant, grinding fear that had been his companion for so long began to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity. He found a new gig, washing dishes at a small, family-owned Italian restaurant in Little Italy called Trattoria Bellucci. It wasn't much, just a few hours every evening for cash under the table, but it was more than he'd had in a long time. It meant a guaranteed meal at the end of his shift and a handful of dollars in his pocket. The owner, a stout woman named Sofia Bellucci, with a fiery temper and a surprisingly kind heart, had hired him on the spot. She hadn't asked for papers or references, just looked him up and down with her shrewd, dark eyes and said, "You look like you're not afraid of hard work. The sink is in the back. Don't break my plates." Leo threw himself into the work, scrubbing pots and pans until his hands were raw. He was quiet, efficient, and never complained. He listened to the boisterous laughter and rapid-fire Italian conversations that flowed from the dining room, a world away from his silent life under the bridge. He learned the rhythms of the restaurant, the pre-dinner rush, the lull before the late-night crowd, the comforting smell of garlic and simmering tomatoes. One evening, as he was mopping the kitchen floor long after the last customers had gone, Sofia's husband, a quiet, watchful man named Enzo, came into the kitchen. Enzo rarely spoke, preferring to observe the restaurant from his usual table in the corner, a small glass of red wine always at his elbow. He was older than Sofia, with a weathered face and hands that looked like they had seen a lifetime of hard labor. "You're a good worker, kid," Enzo said, his voice a low rumble. Leo stopped mopping, surprised that Enzo was speaking to him directly. "Thank you, sir." Enzo swirled the wine in his glass, his eyes fixed on the dark liquid.
"A friend of mine mentioned you, said you were a good kid, a kid with respect." Leo's stomach tightened. A friend? He didn't have any friends, certainly none that would know a man like Enzo Bellucci. I don't know who you mean, sir." Enzo finally looked up, and his eyes, though not as piercing as the stranger's, held a similar weight, a similar depth of knowledge. "He said you helped him out a while back, when he was having a bad day." The kitchen suddenly felt very small.
The hum of the refrigerator was deafening. Leo's heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm. He knew with absolute certainty who Enzo was talking about. The man from the alley. "It was nothing," Leo said, his voice barely a whisper. "He looked hungry." Enzo smiled, a rare, fleeting expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "In our world, kid, there's no such thing as nothing. Every action has a consequence. Every favor is a seed. You planted a seed that night in very fertile ground." He took a sip of his wine. "Sofia and we have a small room upstairs. It's not much, but it's warm and dry. We could use a handyman, someone to help with repairs, take out the trash. It comes with a bed and 3 meals a day, if you want it." Leo stood there, speechless, the mop handle slipping in his sweaty grasp. A room, a bed, a home. It was everything he had ever dreamed of, a fantasy so distant it had felt impossible. And it was being offered to him now because of a single, crumpled $5 bill, because of a simple act of kindness to a stranger. He didn't understand the rules of this new world he had stumbled into, the world of unspoken debts and watchful friends. But as he looked at Enzo, he understood one thing. The seed he had planted was starting to grow. and he was terrified to see how tall the tree would be. The room above the trattoria was small, little more than a closet with a cot, a single window that overlooked a brick wall, and a bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. To Leo, it was a palace. For the first time in over a year, he had a door he could close, a space that was his own. The simple act of lying down on a mattress, a thin blanket pulled up to his chin, felt like the ultimate luxury. The constant tension in his shoulders began to ease. He no longer had to sleep with one eye open, listening for threats in the dark. The sounds that lulled him to sleep now were the distant clatter of pots and pans from the kitchen below and the murmur of late-night conversations in the street. Sounds of life, not survival. He fell into a routine. Mornings were spent doing odd jobs for the Belluccis, fixing a leaky faucet, painting a wall, unloading crates of tomatoes and olive oil. Afternoons were his own, a strange, unfamiliar stretch of time he didn't know how to fill. He would wander through the neighborhood, a historic, tight-knit community of brick tenements and ornate churches, where old men sat on stoops playing cards, and women called to each other from open windows. He felt like a ghost, an outsider, looking in on a world of belonging. Everyone seemed connected by a web of shared history and unspoken understanding. He saw the way they treated Enzo Bellucci, the respectful nods he received as he walked down the street, the way people would stop talking when he entered a shop. Enzo was more than just a restaurant owner. He was an important man in this community, a man of influence. And Leo was now under his protection. He knew it, and he could feel that everyone else knew it too. No one bothered him. The local toughs who liked to harass outsiders gave him a wide berth. The shopkeepers would give him a free piece of fruit or a fresh loaf of bread, pressing it into his hand with a knowing smile and a quiet, "From Enzo." It was a comfortable existence, but it was also unsettling. He was living a life that wasn't truly his, a life built on a debt he didn't understand, owed to a man he didn't know. Who was the man from the alley? Why had he taken such an interest in him? These questions gnawed at him during the quiet hours of the afternoon. One day, while exploring a few blocks away from the trattoria, he stumbled upon a small park with a neglected basketball court. A group of kids, younger than him, were playing a rough game, their sneakers kicking up dust from the cracked asphalt. Leo sat on a bench and watched, a pang of longing in his chest. He used to love basketball. He had been good at it once. He had dreamed of playing for his high school team before everything fell apart. He watched as one of the kids, a skinny boy with more enthusiasm than skill, kept trying to make a layup, failing each time. The other boys laughed at him, their taunts sharp and cruel. The boy's face grew red with shame, and he was about to give up when Leo found himself standing up. He didn't think about it. He just acted. He walked on to the court. "Hey," he said to the boy, "you're jumping too early. Try taking one more step before you go up." The other kids stopped laughing and turned to stare at him, the unfamiliar older boy who had invaded their turf. "Who are you?" one of them demanded. Leo ignored him and focused on the younger boy. "Here, let me show you." He took the ball, bounced it a few times to get the feel of it, then demonstrated the move, his body remembering the familiar rhythm. 1, 2, jump, release. The ball arched through the air and swished cleanly through the net. There was a moment of stunned silence. The younger boy's eyes were wide with admiration. Leo passed him the ball. "Your turn. Remember, one more step." The boy tried again, his movements hesitant but more controlled. He missed, but the ball bounced off the rim, much closer than before. "Almost," Leo said with a smile. "Try again." He spent the rest of the afternoon on that court, coaching the younger boy, whose name was Marco. He forgot about his questions, his fears, his borrowed life. He was just a kid playing basketball, sharing something he loved. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the court, the other boys started to leave. Marco stayed behind. "Thanks," he said shyly. "No one's ever showed me how to do that before." "No problem," Leo said, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the exercise. He started to walk away when Marco called out to him. "Hey, you work at Bellucci's, right?" Leo nodded. A strange look crossed Marco's face, a mixture of awe and something else. Fear. "My grandfather eats there sometimes," Marco said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He's an important man." Before Leo could ask what he meant, Marco turned and ran off, disappearing down a side street. Leo stood there for a moment, the basketball still cradled in his arm, a feeling of unease washing over him. He had a sinking feeling that he had just met the grandson of the man with the stormy grey eyes. The encounter with Marco in the park left Leo feeling exposed. He had tried to remain invisible, to be the quiet dishwasher, the anonymous handyman. But now he had stepped out of the shadows, however briefly. He had interacted with the family of the man who was silently orchestrating his life. He felt like a pawn on a chessboard, moved by an unseen hand for reasons he couldn't fathom. He started to feel watched again. He would catch glimpses of men in dark suits sitting in parked cars across the street from the trattoria, their faces impassive, their eyes hidden behind sunglasses. They never approached him, never spoke to him, but their presence was a constant, unnerving reminder of his situation. Was this protection, or was it a gilded cage? He was grateful for the roof over his head and the food in his belly, but the price was a gnawing uncertainty. He felt a desperate need for answers, but he didn't know who to ask. He couldn't ask Enzo or Sofia. They had been kind to him, but he knew they were bound by a code of silence. They would never betray the confidence of their friend. His anxiety began to affect his work. He became jumpy, dropping a stack of plates one night when a car backfired in the street, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Sofia rushed into the kitchen, her face a mask of concern. "Leo, are you all right?" she asked, her voice surprisingly gentle. He stood amidst the broken porcelain, his hands shaking. "I'm sorry, Sofia. I don't know what happened." She looked at him, her dark eyes filled with a sad understanding. She didn't scold him for his clumsiness. Instead, she placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's a lot to take in, isn't it?" she said softly. Living in a new world, her words confirmed what he already suspected. She knew everything. He looked at her, his eyes pleading for some kind of explanation. "Why?" he whispered. "Why me?" Sofia sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. She pulled up a stool and sat down, a rare break from her constant motion. "Let me tell you a story, Leo," she began. "Many years ago, when Enzo and I first opened this restaurant, we had nothing. We put every penny we had into this place. A bigger, more powerful family wanted this territory. They tried to push us out. They vandalized our property, threatened our suppliers, scared away our customers. We were ready to give up." She paused, her gaze distant as she remembered the past. Then one night, their leader came in. He sat right there at that table in the corner, and he told Enzo that if we weren't gone by the end of the week, he would burn this place to the ground, with us inside it. We were terrified. We had no one to turn to. The police. They were no help in these matters. Leo listened, captivated, the broken plates forgotten on the floor. "That same night," Sofia continued, "another man came in. He was young then, but he had the same eyes he has today. The eyes of an old soul. He had heard about our troubles. He sat down with the man who was threatening us. They spoke for a long time, their voices low. I don't know what was said, but when they were done, the man who had threatened us was pale, sweating. He stood up, bowed his head respectfully to the younger man, and left. We never saw him or his men again." She looked at Leo, her expression serious. "The man who helped us. He asked for nothing in return, but Enzo swore that day that our family, the Bellucci family, would be loyal to his for the rest of our lives. That man was Don Costello. He is the head of our family. He is the man you gave your last $5 to." The name hung in the air between them. Don Costello, a Mafia don, the leader of one of the city's most powerful crime families. Leo felt the blood drain from his face, He had seen movies, read stories. These were not men you crossed. These were men of violence and fear, but the man he had met, the man who had looked so broken and weary in the alley, didn't fit that image. And the man Sophia described, the one who protected a young couple from predators, seemed like someone else entirely. He's... Leo couldn't bring himself to say the word. Sophia nodded grimly. He is a man of honor, Leo. In our world, that is the highest virtue. When you, a boy with nothing, showed him kindness with no expectation of reward, you showed him the same kind of honor. You reminded him of a principle that his own people sometimes forget. He saw a purity in your action that he felt compelled to protect. She stood up and started to help him pick up the broken pieces of ceramic. He is not a monster, Leo. He is a man shaped by a hard world. He protects his own. And now, whether you like it or not, he considers you one of his own. The revelation left Leo reeling. He was under the protection of a Mafia don. It was a truth more terrifying and more strangely comforting than he could have ever imagined. Learning the truth about Don Costello didn't make Leo's life any simpler. In fact, it complicated everything. He was no longer just a homeless kid who had gotten a lucky break. He was the ward of a powerful, dangerous man. The knowledge was a heavy weight. He saw the world around him differently now. The respectful nods given to Enzo, the sudden availability of the best produce at the market, the way minor disputes in the neighborhood were quietly resolved without police involvement. It was all part of an invisible system of power and influence, with Don Costello at its center. Leo felt trapped between gratitude and fear. He owed his survival to this man, but he wanted no part in the world he represented. He was a dishwasher, a handyman, not a gangster. He tried to keep his head down, to focus on his work and save the small amount of money Sophia paid him. His dream was simple, to save enough to get a small apartment of his own, far away from this neighborhood, to go back to school and to live a normal life. He was determined not to be drawn any deeper into Don Costello's world. But that world had a way of pulling you in. One afternoon, Leo was sent to pick up a special order of bread from a bakery a few blocks away. As he was walking back to the trattoria, a car screeched to a halt beside him. Two young men, barely older than him, jumped out. They weren't from the neighborhood. They had the hard, arrogant look of street-level thugs trying to make a name for themselves. "Hey, you're the kid from Bellucci's, right?" one of them sneered. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. He clutched the bag of bread to his chest and tried to walk past them. The second man blocked his path. "We have a message for Enzo," he said, shoving Leo against a brick wall. The bag of bread fell to the ground. "Tell him this is O'Malley's territory now. The Costello family is finished. It's time for old men to step aside." The first man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "And to show we're serious." He pulled back his fist. Leo braced himself for the impact, closing his eyes, but the punch never landed. He heard a sickening thud, followed by a grunt of pain. He opened his eyes. Enzo's quiet husband was suddenly there, as if he had materialized out of thin air. He had the first thug by the arm, twisting it at an unnatural angle. The thug's face was contorted in agony. The second man, seeing his friend neutralized, pulled out a small knife. Enzo moved with a speed that was shocking in a man his age. He released the first thug, who crumpled to the ground, and stepped inside the second man's reach, disarming him with a single, fluid motion. He held the knife to the young man's throat. "You come into our neighborhood," Enzo said, his voice a low, deadly whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "You threaten our family. You have made a grave mistake." His eyes were cold, hard chips of flint. The arrogant swagger of the two thugs had evaporated, replaced by raw, primal fear. We were just sending a message," the one with the knife stammered. "Message received," Enzo hissed. He let the man go, who scrambled to his feet, helped his whimpering friend, and they both fled down the street, disappearing as quickly as they had arrived. Enzo picked up the knife, wiped the handle clean with a handkerchief, and slipped it into his pocket. He then picked up the bag of bread, dusted it off, and handed it to Leo, who was still pressed against the wall, his body shaking uncontrollably. Enzo's demeanor changed instantly. The cold killer was gone, replaced by the quiet, concerned restaurant owner. "Are you all right, Leo?" he asked, his voice calm. Leo could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. He had just seen a side of Enzo he never knew existed. He had seen the reality of Don Costello's world, a world where disputes weren't settled with words, but with swift, brutal violence. "Come," Enzo said, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Let's go back to the restaurant. Sophia will make you some sweet tea." As they walked back in silence, Leo realized the foolishness of his dream of a simple, normal life. He wasn't on the outside looking in anymore. He was in the middle of it. A message had been sent, and he had been the messenger. A war was brewing between rival families, and he was standing on the front line. The incident with O'Malley's thugs shattered Leo's fragile sense of security. The trattoria, which had been his sanctuary, now felt like the calm at the center of a gathering storm. A tension settled over the neighborhood. The old men on the stoop stopped playing cards, their faces grim and watchful. The laughter from the open windows was replaced by hushed, anxious conversations. Leo could feel the fear in the air. It was a living thing, coiling in the shadows of the alleys and clinging to the brickwork of the old buildings. Enzo and Sophia tried to shield him from it, treating him with an almost parental gentleness, but he saw the worry in their eyes. He saw Enzo cleaning a handgun late at night in the kitchen, his movements practiced and efficient. He saw Sophia whispering into the phone in rapid, panicked Italian, her hand trembling. He was no longer just a dishwasher. He was part of the family, and the family was in danger. He felt an overwhelming urge to run, to disappear back into the anonymity of the streets where the only threat was hunger and cold, not bullets and knives. But he couldn't. He thought of Sophia's kindness, of Enzo's quiet protection. They had taken him in, given him a home. To abandon them now, when they were facing a threat because of their loyalty to the man who had helped him, felt like the ultimate betrayal. He was bound to them, not by force, but by a sense of honor he hadn't realized he possessed. So he stayed. He worked harder than ever, trying to make himself useful, trying to repay their kindness in the only way he knew how. He scrubbed floors until they gleamed, polished silver until it shone, and took on any task they gave him without complaint. It was his way of showing solidarity, of saying, "I'm with you," without having to speak the words. One rainy evening, much like the one when he had met Don Costello, the bell above the trattoria's door chimed. Leo was in the kitchen, but he could hear the sudden silence that fell over the dining room. He peeked through the swinging doors. Don Costello was standing there, flanked by two large men in dark coats. He was no longer the broken, weary man from the alley. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He radiated an aura of immense power and absolute control. His stormy grey eyes swept across the room, and for a moment they met Leo's. There was no flicker of recognition, no sign that they had ever met. His expression was impassive, unreadable. Enzo and Sophia hurried to greet him, their faces a mixture of respect and apprehension. "Don Costello," Enzo said, bowing his head slightly. "It is an honor, Enzo." "Sophia," the Don said, his voice calm and even. "I am sorry to disturb your evening." He looked around the small, empty restaurant. "I hear you've had some trouble, from the Irish." "It was nothing, Don Costello," Enzo said quickly. "A couple of young punks, we handled it." Don Costello's gaze was sharp. "I have been away, Enzo, on business. I have only just returned and heard the news. O'Malley is getting bold. He thinks because I am old, I am weak. He needs to be reminded of the old ways. He needs to be taught a lesson in respect." He turned his attention back to the kitchen doors. his eyes finding Leo's again. This time, he held his gaze. "I need to borrow your boy," he said to Enzo, his voice leaving no room for argument. A cold dread washed over Leo. He felt Sophia's hand grip his arm, her knuckles white. Enzo hesitated for only a second. "Of course, Don Costello. Whatever you need." Don Costello gestured for Leo to come forward. "Come, son. We're going for a ride." Leo's legs felt like lead as he walked out of the kitchen, out of the warmth and safety of the trattoria, and into the cold, rain-swept night. He was getting into a car with a Mafia Don on his way to a lesson in respect. He was sure he was not going to be the student, but the textbook. The inside of the black sedan was like another world. The scent of rich leather and expensive cologne filled the air. The ride was so smooth and silent, it felt like they were gliding rather than driving. Leo sat beside Don Costello, his body rigid, his hands clenched into tight fists in his lap. He stared out the window at the blurred city lights, his mind racing. Was this a punishment? A test? Was he being taken somewhere to be eliminated, a loose end in a dangerous game? Don Costello didn't speak for a long time. He simply sat there, staring straight ahead, his hands resting on a silver-headed cane. The silence was heavier, more intimidating than any threat. Finally, as they drove through a dark, industrial part of the city, he spoke, his voice a low rumble. "You're scared," he said. It wasn't a question. Leo swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." The Don turned his head slightly, his grey eyes studying Leo's profile. "Fear is not a weakness, son. It's a survival instinct. Only fools and dead men feel no fear. The question is what you do with it. Do you let it control you, or do you control it?" He paused, letting the words sink in. "I know what you're thinking. You think I'm a monster, a killer." He sighed, a surprisingly human sound. "I have done things in my life I'm not proud of. I have made choices that haunt me in the quiet hours of the night. But I have lived my life by a code of honor. You protect your family, you repay your debts, you show respect to those who have earned it, and you demand it from those who have not." The car slowed and turned into a dark, deserted warehouse district. It pulled up in front of a large, corrugated steel building and stopped. The two men in the front got out and opened the doors for them. Don Costello got out of the car and looked at Leo. "Come with me." Leo's heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his ears. He followed the Don into the warehouse. The inside was vast and empty, except for a single chair in the center of the concrete floor, illuminated by a bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. A man was tied to the chair. It was one of O'Malley's thugs, the one who had pulled the knife on Enzo. He was bruised and bloody, his eyes wide with terror. Several of Don Costello's men stood in the shadows along the walls, their faces grim. Don Costello walked slowly towards the man in the chair, his cane tapping a slow, rhythmic beat on the concrete. He stopped in front of him and looked down, his expression cold and unforgiving. "You were sent to my territory," the Don said, his voice dangerously soft. "You threatened a man under my protection. You put your hands on a boy who is now part of my family." He gestured towards Leo with his cane. "This boy. This homeless boy with nothing to his name showed me more honor and respect with $5 than you have shown in your entire pathetic life." He turned to Leo. "This is the world you have stumbled into, son. It is an ugly world, a world of violence and consequences. I did not choose it for you, but you are in it now, and in this world, disrespect cannot go unanswered." He held out his silver-headed cane to Leo. "This man tried to harm you. He insulted our family. The honor of the family demands that he be punished, and the punishment must be delivered by the one who was wronged." Leo stared at the cane, then at the terrified man in the chair, then at Don Costello's unyielding face. He felt sick to his stomach. This was the test. He was being asked to commit an act of violence, to become one of them. It was a choice, a crossroads. and he knew with chilling certainty that his life depended on what he did next. Time seemed to slow down. The only sounds in the vast warehouse were the terrified, ragged breathing of the man in the chair and the low hum of the single light bulb overhead. Don Costello's arm remained outstretched, offering the heavy, silver-headed cane. It was a scepter, a symbol of power, and an invitation to violence. Leo's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and terror. He looked at the thug's bloodied face, the fear in his eyes, and he didn't feel anger or a desire for revenge. He felt pity. This man was a product of the same cruel streets that had almost broken him. He was a bully, a coward, but he was still a human being. Leo thought of his mother, of her gentle hands and her simple lessons about kindness. What would she think of him now, standing in a dark warehouse, being asked to mete out brutal justice? He looked at Don Costello, at the powerful, dangerous man who had saved him, and for the first time he found the courage to speak his own truth. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I can't." A murmur went through the men standing in the shadows. Don Costello's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something unreadable passed through his grey eyes. "He threatened you," the Don stated, his voice flat. "He would have hurt you badly if Enzo hadn't been there." "I know," Leo said, his voice gaining strength. "But beating him won't change that. It will just make me like him." He took a deep breath. "You said you live by a code of honor. You said you repay your debts. You saved me from the streets. You gave me a home and a family. My debt is to you, not to him. And my honor won't let me do this." He held Don Costello's gaze, his heart pounding, expecting an explosion of anger, a swift, violent punishment for his defiance. He had refused the Don in front of his men. It was a fatal mistake. The warehouse was silent for a long, tense moment. Then, to Leo's utter astonishment, the corners of Don Costello's mouth turned up in a slow, genuine smile. He lowered his arm and leaned on his cane. He started to laugh. It wasn't a cruel or mocking laugh, but a deep, rich sound of pure, unadulterated approval. He turned to his men, his eyes shining. "You see," he said, his voice booming in the cavernous space. "You see? This is what I was talking about. This is honor, not brute force, not mindless violence. This." He turned back to Leo and placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. The hand that had offered him a weapon now offered him comfort. "In all my years," the Don said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have been surrounded by men who obey me out of fear. They do what I say because they are afraid of what I will do to them if they don't. But you stood up to me. You chose your own code over mine. You chose mercy over vengeance. You have the heart of a king, son." He squeezed Leo's shoulder. "I didn't bring you here to make you a monster. I brought you here to see what you were made of, and you are made of steel." He turned to the man in the chair. "Let him go," he commanded. His men, looking stunned, quickly cut the thug loose. The man, sobbing with relief, scrambled to his feet. "Get out of my city," Don Costello said, his voice dropping back to its cold, authoritative tone. "Tell your boss, O'Malley, that the Costello family is not finished, and tell him about the boy who showed him more mercy than he deserved. Tell him that that is the true strength of my family." The thug didn't need to be told twice. He fled into the night. Don Costello put his arm around Leo's shoulders and led him back towards the car. "Let's go home, son. Sophia is probably worried sick. We'll tell her you taught an old man a lesson tonight." The ride back to the trattoria was different. The heavy, intimidating silence was gone, replaced by a comfortable quiet. Leo no longer felt like a prisoner. He felt seen, understood. Don Costello didn't treat him like a charity case or a pawn anymore. He spoke to him as an equal, asking him about his life before the streets, about his dreams for the future. Leo, hesitant at first, found himself opening up, telling this powerful Mafia Don about his mother, his love for basketball, his forgotten dream of finishing high school and maybe, just maybe, going to college. Don Costello listened intently, his grey eyes filled with a paternal warmth that Leo hadn't seen before. "A boy with your heart and your mind deserves an education," the Don said as they pulled up in front of the restaurant. "He deserves a chance to build a life, not just survive one." He didn't elaborate, but the words were planted, another seed in the fertile ground of Leo's future. When they walked into the trattoria, Sophia and Enzo rushed towards them, their faces etched with worry. Sophia hugged Leo tightly, her relief palpable. Enzo looked at Don Costello, a question in his eyes. "The boy's fine, Enzo," the Don said with a smile. "More than fine. He is a credit to us all." That night marked a profound shift in Leo's life. The fear that had been his constant companion finally loosened its grip. He understood now that Don Costello's protection was not a cage, but a shield, one that would allow him the freedom to become the person he was meant to be. The next morning, a man in a sharp suit arrived at the trattoria. He introduced himself as Don Costello's personal lawyer. He had come with a proposal. The Don had established a trust fund in Leo's name. It was enough to cover his living expenses, his high school equivalency exams, and a full 4-year scholarship to any university in the state. There was only one condition: that he work hard, that he stay true to his principles, and that he never forget the meaning of honor. Leo was overwhelmed, speechless. He tried to refuse, saying it was too much, that he hadn't done anything to deserve it, but the lawyer simply smiled. "Don Costello considers it the repayment of a debt," he explained. "A $5 debt, with interest. With the help of the Bellucci's and the Don's resources, Leo enrolled in a program to get his GED. He studied with a ferocity he didn't know he possessed, driven by a desire not to disappoint the people who had shown him such incredible faith. He discovered he had a sharp mind for numbers and business, a skill that earned him a respectful nod from Enzo, who started teaching him the basics of managing the restaurant's finances. He even started playing basketball again at the same park where he had met Marco. He became a mentor to the neighborhood kids, a quiet, steady presence they all looked up to. He never saw O'Malley's men again. Word on the street was that the Irish gang had quietly retreated, their ambitions humbled not by a show of force, but by the story of the Don's merciful boy. Leo's act of defiance in the warehouse had become a local legend, a testament to a different kind of power. He was no longer just the kid from Bellucci's. He was Leo, a young man of principle, respected in his own right. Years began to pass. Leo earned his GED with top honors. He was accepted into Northwestern University to study business. The day he left for college, the entire neighborhood turned out to see him off. Sophia cried and packed him enough food to feed an entire dormitory. Enzo, in a rare display of emotion, pulled him into a rough embrace and whispered, "Make us proud, son." The last person to say goodbye was Don Costello. He arrived not in his black sedan but in a simple town car, and he was alone. He looked older, more frail than Leo remembered, but his grey eyes were as sharp as ever. He handed Leo a small, wrapped gift. "For your new life," he said. Leo opened it. It was a beautiful leather-bound journal. On the first page, in elegant script, was an inscription: "A man of honor always repays his debts." "You don't owe me anything," Leo said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given me everything." Don Costello shook his head. "You gave me something far more valuable, Leo. On a day when I was lost in my own darkness, sitting in an alley feeling the weight of my world, you showed me a simple, selfless kindness. You reminded me of the good in people, something I had long forgotten. You saved a part of my soul that day. That is a debt I can never fully repay." They stood in silence for a moment, the old Mafia Don and the young man he had taken under his wing. Two people from completely different worlds, bound together by a single act of compassion. "Go on, son," the Don said, his voice gentle. "Build a good life, a life of honor, That will be the only payment I ever need. Leo excelled at university. His life on the streets had given him a focus and a determination that his more privileged classmates lacked. He never took a single opportunity for granted. He studied hard, made friends, and for the first time allowed himself to have a future that wasn't dictated by survival. He visited the trattoria on holidays, and each time he returned, he was welcomed like a conquering hero. He would spend hours in the kitchen with Sofia, sharing stories of his classes, and late nights in the office with Enzo, discussing business strategies for the restaurant. He never forgot where he came from. He volunteered at homeless shelters, using his growing knowledge of business to help them with their finances and operations. He wanted to give others the same kind of chance he had been given. During his senior year, he received a call from Enzo. Don Costello was ill. His health was failing, and he was asking for him. Leo drove back to Chicago immediately, his heart heavy with dread. He was led not to a mansion or a grand estate, but to a modest brick house in the old neighborhood, the same one Don Costello had lived in his entire life. The Don was in a bed in the living room, looking small and fragile against the white pillows. The immense power and authority he had once commanded had faded, but his grey eyes, though clouded with age and illness, still held their familiar spark. He smiled weakly when he saw Leo. "The college man," he rasped. "Look at you. You've become everything I knew you would." Leo sat by his bedside, and they talked for hours. The Don didn't speak of his business or his enemies. He spoke of his wife, who had died many years ago, of his grandson Marco, and of his regret. He spoke of the night in the alley, how he had been mourning the anniversary of his wife's death, feeling utterly alone in the world, until a skinny, rain-soaked kid had offered him his last $5. "You were an angel of mercy that night, Leo," he whispered, his voice failing. "My angel." Later that evening, with Leo holding his hand, Don Angelo Costello passed away peacefully. He was not surrounded by his soldiers or his lieutenants, but by the young man who had become the son he never had. The funeral was a massive affair, attended by people from every corner of the city, from powerful men in expensive suits to the poor and forgotten people of the neighborhood whom the Don had quietly protected for years. Leo stood with Sofia, Enzo, and Marco, who was now a young man himself. After the service, the Don's lawyer approached Leo. He explained that Don Costello had made some final arrangements. He had left the majority of his legitimate businesses, the real estate holdings, the import-export companies, the restaurants, not to his blood relatives, but to Leo. He said you were the only one he trusted to run them with honor, the lawyer explained. He said you knew the difference between power and strength. Leo was stunned. He was now the heir to a legitimate business empire built on the foundations of a criminal one. It was the Don's final, most profound gift, a chance not just to build his own life, but to reshape a legacy. He could sell everything and walk away, or he could take what the Don had given him and transform it, using his business acumen and his innate sense of compassion to create something new, something that generated not fear and power, but opportunity and hope for the community that had become his home. He thought of the $5 bill, a small, crumpled piece of paper that had set this entire, improbable story in motion. He thought of Don Costello's final words, that a life of honor would be the only payment he ever needed. The choice was clear. Leo accepted his inheritance, but on his own terms. He began to slowly and carefully transform the Costello holdings. He invested in the neighborhood, creating scholarships, funding community centers, and providing startup loans for small businesses. He turned the feared Costello name into a symbol of philanthropy and renewal. He continued to manage the Trattoria Bellucci, not because he needed the money, but because it was his home, the place where his new life had begun. He never forgot the boy he was, shivering in a bakery doorway with nothing but a single bill in his pocket and a belief in the simple power of kindness. He had learned that a single act of compassion can ripple outwards in ways you can never predict. He had been given a second chance at life, a life of purpose and meaning, all because he chose to feed a hungry stranger, proving that in a world of darkness, the smallest light can change everything. What is the one act of kindness, given or received, that has changed your life? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of the incredible power of the human heart.